And at this time, I will pass the virtual mic to you.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you for the invitation. The conversation we're speaking on is very important, but I'm going to start off with just a little bit more information about myself and how I began in this work and what informed me moving into this space. So I am a Chicago native, grew up in a very conservative Christian home. I always tell people that evangelical religion was the last group to have its hand on me. Um, and, I worked in the nonprofit sector for about 11 years while in Las Vegas. So I've done everything from like women's relations, at-risk youth, mental health, Parkinson's, even fashion and nonprofit. And so, nonprofit work is really about working on the symptom side of things. You see how people are struggling, and I got to a place where I was just like, how do I fix this? God, how do I fix this? It must be something I'm missing. And it was really my faith and like really studying like how Christ moved while he was here, why I got into the nonprofit sector anyway. Like I've always just had this thing, like I want to help, I want to heal, I want to help, I want to heal. And that's how I got started in the nonprofit sector. And then it graduated into, God, what else should I be doing? What else should I be paying attention to? Like guide me to the piece that I'm missing. And that's when a very eccentric friend of mine now, found me in a crowd, and he was just like, your hair is super big. Your personality must be too. I need you to come and join this community meeting. And, we were just talking about voting and a mayoral election, and he kept dragging me to these meetings, listening to things people were struggling with. And, he started getting me politically engaged. And that's when I came over to the social justice side. I was like, I need to learn about legislation, learn about policy. I need to, listen to more people, on the daily. I need to meet with our elected officials. I need to make sure that marginalized people's voices are at the center of solutions. And so that's how I got involved in social justice work and started that work in 2014, just being a community ambassador, literally talking to people every day. Who are you? Who am I? How we connect, as people. What are you struggling with? And what are those lanes that you can access? So that more people know, like, you're not just a statistic, like you have a face, you have a family, what you're facing is real. And I started out with a group as a community ambassador and rolled right into the election cycle of 2016, where I worked the field and, did canvassing and field organizing and, media trainings, all of that. Rolled right from that horrific 2016 decision into Women's March. And I'm sure a lot of you on here have heard of Women's March. I became the state coordinator of Nevada. I was state coordinator from 2016 in November to 2019, like March of 2019. So I've done everything from not only field organizing and mobilization for elections, but also a lot of civil disobedience work. So even as we, talk about and, have the moment of silence for Justice Ginsburg, I was part of the original ground team trying to make sure that Justice Kavanaugh did not get on the bench in DC. And that was a hard fight. And it was a fight that she knew that we had to do all we could to win, to try and not get that nomination confirmed if people's voices were heard and our elected officials knew what their constituents were struggling through. So what's happening now is very personal to me just because of that involvement. But these conversations need to happen. What does it mean to be civically engaged, to own the democratic process, to not just have your own self-interest, but, the self-interest of humanity when we go to the polls, when we organize. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Deborah. Jose, I'll pass it to you to do your beginning intro piece too.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. What I wanted to do is kind of complicate the matter a little bit more. I mean, that's part of my job, is to complicate things. So first of all, complicate the very term Latinx and who is involved therein. It is very interesting to find out that, one, recent studies have showed that the very term Latinx is actually troublesome for a lot of people who we would call Latinx, myself included. Nevertheless, it becomes a very useful term in terms of fighting some fights that need to be fought in terms of non-binary identity, patriarchal identity, etc. It's also problematic in the sense that recent immigrants don't use any term like Latino, Latinx, Hispanic. Rather, they refer to themselves as the countries of origin. So I'm Guatemalan, I'm Mexican, I'm Cuban, I'm Dominican. And that's an important distinction to be made, in large part because when we speak of the term Latinx, and I do use the term Latinx because I do think it's useful, when we use the term Latinx, we're really talking about a very variegated, diverse landscape of peoples made up of races. So Latinx is not a race, it's a culture, a pan culture, or a culture of cultures that includes all the races that one can imagine on the face of the earth, really. If you come anywhere from anywhere from south of Texas and California, anywhere in the Caribbean, and in some sense, you can use the term Latinx or Latino or Latina, whatever you prefer. Of course, the term Hispanic cannot be used by everyone in the Latin American context. But then I want to now complicate the term Latin American. First, we tend to assume that Latin America is simply anything south of us as a country. But if we use the definitions of culture, language, practices, rituals, faiths, we could say that Los Angeles is Latin America. We can say that Chicago is Latin America. We can say that Buffalo, New York is Latin America. So part of the complicatedness is the fact that we're actually a really hard group to pin down. Several years back, George Lopez, the great comedian and sometimes prophet, once did a documentary for PBS. It was called Brown is the New Green. And what he deduced was that the only pinning down that's ever been done for Latinx as a group is for the sake of consumerism. What can we sell this mass of people so that we can take their money? And so any efforts to sort of define us have been defined through consumerism, which I don't need to tell you what are the problems there. What I also wanted to do briefly is highlight some of the places where the Latinx vote is large. And here I want to talk about percentages, because as we know with the Electoral College, whether you love it or hate it, I have my opinions. The percentages per state is really critical here. Most people might think that the largest, percentage-wise, that the largest block of Latinx voters is California or maybe Texas. You'd be close, but it's actually New Mexico, with 43% of the electorate being Latinx of some sort. Now, the New Mexico situation is a very interesting one in that you actually have people who see themselves as historic Spanish people from before any sort of acquisition of those territories, and actually prefer the term Hispano over the term Latin American, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, and some even prefer the term Spanish. Former Governor Richardson is of Hispano descent. So 43%. California then claims 31%. Texas, 30%. I won't go through all the numbers. What shocks me though is that the number total of Latino and Latina voters is, of the total population of Latinx persons is higher than the total number of eligible Latinx voters. That's a critical piece to understand the mobilization of Latinx people. What do I mean by that? My hermana here, Deborah, highlighted the importance of owning the democratic process. What happens when you have no right to any of that ownership? What happens when we talked, for example, about California having a 31% of eligible Latinx voters, but there's actually a 39% Latinx population. In Arizona, for example, and the gap is bigger there, you have a 7% difference between eligible voter and total number of Latinx persons. In Illinois, you have 17% of total Latinx population, but of that 17%, 12% are eligible to vote. I also kind of looked at the numbers briefly, and I wanted to see, were there any states where a third to a half of the Latinx populations cannot vote? So the percentage of eligible voters, Latinx, versus the percentage of overall Latinx populations in the state. You're going to see a pattern here. No surprises here. Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Iowa, North Carolina, and I'll stop here because North Carolina, as we've seen from Reverend Barber's work, has been one of those states that have been fighting voter suppression. One of the pieces that I like to highlight is that immigration tactics is part of voter suppression. And sometimes those get put apart, and maybe politically, for the sake of organizing, they should be seen as sort of two sides of the same coin, or one as a tactic of the other, et cetera, et cetera. So North Carolina, Oklahoma, Kentucky, we don't need to talk about who's in Kentucky, Kansas, Maryland, Delaware, Idaho, Kansas. And then there are some states that are not generally from the South that also have a high percentage of Latinx population, but not a high percentage of those being eligible, like Oregon, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri. It seems to me that I think it's important that as we look at the Latinx voting bloc, that not all Latinx can actually be eligible to be part of the voting bloc. And then lastly, I would just end with this. In addition to the fact that I've already mentioned that it's a very diverse group, and diverse politically as well, with, for example, Mexican Americans probably being the most democratic bloc, and Cuban Americans probably being the most Republican bloc of the Latinx communities, and then a bunch of different nationalities there in between. The other piece that I want to highlight is the ways in which, when you do community organizing, the way we see that what I call, there are tender points of tension between oppressed communities. So between Latinx communities and African American communities, between Latinx communities and between Asian and Asian American communities. Sometimes it's religious, within a predominantly Hispanic Christian and really Catholic voting bloc, and say Muslim Americans, for example, which puts Latinx Muslims in a really interesting place. So I think part of the other piece that I want to address with religious leaders at places that there are these tender points of tension and contact between different oppressed communities. We always talk about divide and conquer, obviously that's there. And it's perennially tender because the powers that be like to prod at it, like to poke at it, like to keep those places tender. And I want to invite us as religious leaders not to kind of avoid that conversation, to say, oh, but actually to step into those tender places and to listen deeply and to find within the tender places. Because the thing is, both sides are tender, to find ways that the work of pastoral care, the work of healing can be a political act as we move to these unfortunate political times in which we're in. That's it for now. I don't want to eat up a lot of time.
Thanks, Jose. Deborah, I'm just going to invite you back into conversation to be a little bit in conversation with Jose, responding and just sort of piggybacking off, if you will, of his remarks. Give you two some time to.
Well, you know, and we talked about this the other day, and you just made a comment just now, like talking about those tender points, stepping into that courageously, but not lightly, but also using that bravery as like a political force as well. So when I made the comment earlier, like owning your part of the democratic process, you know, a lot of us have been conditioned to think of the democratic process only including your vote, when it is way more vast than just your vote, whether it's at the local level or at, you know, the national level, whether it's in a municipal race or for a judge's seat, you know, whether it's for your senator or it's for the president of the United States. And so that's only a piece of it, but there are many parts of the democratic process that we can own, you know, and a lot of that can start like at that healing piece. Because, you know, as I was talking to Jose like a day or so ago, it was like, you know, we didn't get here through one lane. We didn't get to this place of division, bias, hatred, oppression, marginalization by one lane. You know, the white supremacy and its acts of political strategizing included tearing down our minds, included filling our psyches and our spirits with bias, with conditions against one another, with discriminatory acts against one another. And so stepping into places of healing and having courageous conversations and finding out like where your places of oppression meet is a political act, is actually owning a part of the democratic process. Because through that act, you can then see how these pillars of power have been set up to keep you outside of the political process and keep you ignorant to how systems have been set up to discriminate against different facets of people. Also, when we look at owning a part of the democratic process, like let's look at, you know, how we're voting on someone else's behalf, how we're helping tell someone else's story on their behalf, even if they can't vote. How we're using the very truth of someone's life to shape policy. I may not be able to vote as, you know, an ex-offender or as someone that doesn't have, you know, the right immigration status for this country, but who I am and how I live in this country can shape policy. So sharing my story, testifying at many levels of government, working with my elected officials, working with policymakers can help shape how laws affect my way of life and those that I care about in my neighborhoods. You know, I can be a person that helps, you know, draft bills and pushes them forward in legislative sessions. I may not be able to vote on it, but my voice is a part of how my elected official moves on my behalf and the behalf of my people. I may not be able to vote, but I know that Susie Q or Joe Blow from my neighborhood cares more about my block than the fool that's already in there. So I can step into a space and help run his campaign. I can help knock doors for him. I can help make calls for them. And so I think we have to get democracy out of a box. Actually be creative with the amount of power that we have. Because the powers that got us here to this place of marginalization and oppression were very creative over a lot of centuries. And so we need to be able to learn from that and be brave in these spaces that we have power and control over to gain our human dignity back, to gain power back and self-worth back, and create a country that actually reflects everyone that lives here for the benefit of everyone that is here. That removes hatred from systems, that removes racism from systems, that removes it from our psyche, from our culture, from our conversations. So I thank you for bringing up, you know, those tender points, because I know for me, as someone who came from a very conservative, you know, Christian background, I had a lot of those biases, a lot of indifference, a lot of hatred. It was like something that was like, it was like the second washing over, the second baptism of the things that told me that I should distance myself from this person, from that person, from, you know, Catholicism, from Islam, you know, like, and it's so in those ways, I was not only oppressed as a Black woman, but I became an oppressor because of religion. And so stepping into social justice work, I had to very bravely step into those tender spots within myself and ask myself, why am I here? But then also be brave to step into tender spots of, you know, protecting healthcare, no matter, you know, because it is your body. you know, protecting the rights of the rights of women. You know, I had to step into spaces of, you know, protecting, you know, Muslim Americans in this country. You know, step into different spaces that I was taught to stay away from and have bias against. And it informed, you know, how I move today, you know, healing from those processes, you know, actually like taking into consideration like how Christ moved, you know, because he was a social justice, you know, activist, you know. And so like we have to do that in order to have full ownership of not only democracy, but of our human dignity, and actually see human dignity reflected back in other people that don't look like us, that don't live like us, that don't pray like us.
Yeah, I appreciate that response, and I think you're right in that reducing, as important as voting is, and please go vote if you can,
Yes.
but that the democratic process is larger than that. And immediately the historian in me went back to women's suffrage, women organizing for the right to vote, and not having the right to vote and still being able to mobilize towards that end, even before they had the right to vote. I also think of Cesar Chavez's fight for migrant workers, many of whom didn't have the right to vote, and yet, at least for a season, was able to do effective work in farming communities all over the Southwest. You also, I think the tender points, you mentioned the kind of stepping into these other spaces, political spaces that sometimes we're told not to step into. And it's interesting when I look at the Latinx numbers, that another place of connection where we start to address those tender points could be around issues that we share. It is presumptuous to assume that the top issue for Latinx voters is immigration. And when I looked at the numbers, percentage-wise, it's actually in the middle of the top 10, if you will. Economy is the top concern for the Latinx voters. Obviously, I would say that for many Latinx persons in this country, immigration status informs everything else. It informs the economy, it informs healthcare, which is number 2. But I was actually blown away by those places where the Latinx percentage was way higher than the overall national average for this is how important this issue is for us. And there's 6 issues where the Latinx considered it at least 6% more important, like 6% more Hispanics than the national average considered it a top priority. And that was healthcare. COVID response was 10% higher than the national average. The one that actually kind of took me away was climate change. Whereas 42% of US adults consider that to be a top priority in the 2020 elections, 60% of Latinx voters considered it a top priority for the election. So I think there's places where, and of course, immigration was higher among Latinx than the national average. The other one that's a big one, that's a 10% difference between US adults and Latinx in this country, was foreign policy. And we only need to know, look at, for example, where the highest, the biggest increases of Latin American immigration is coming from. Places like Venezuela, where we played not a passive role in kind of turning things around in that country. Usually, any sort of intervention, anytime we intervene, we get a large number of Latinx persons from that community, and we have a history of constantly, on one sense, talking about how we want countries to vote and have a democratic process and vote who they want, but the moment they vote who they want and it doesn't feed our sort of foreign policy and our interests, we invade, we stage coup, we fund the opposition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's very helpful, though, to see the democratic process as larger than just the ability to vote, even as we take that vote with utmost seriousness and treat it as something sacred entrusted to us.
Thank you for sharing that. I think another thing you know, as we look at this election, as we look at the last 4 years, someone just asked me a question. Sorry, I'm going to look at that. Would you give an example of a specific change where it was directly affect this for everyone involved? So the question, hopefully I can do this. I'm probably going out of order. I'm sorry. Lisa, if I am. I feel like it's a good question. I don't know. The person asked, give an example of where I was able to directly affect pretty much change and how we went about it. And a prime example was the occupation of DC for the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. That occupation happened in the year of one of the biggest midterm elections that we have seen. You know, we started hitting the ground running in January with multiple campaigns across the United States called Power to the Polls with Women's March, because we knew we needed to flip the House. And we knew we needed to start early to, you know, get people talking about the issues that matter to them, their families, their communities, get people to have conversations with their current elected officials, start strategizing. But there were still like huge pockets of people that were very much asleep and detached from the process. A lot of people didn't normally vote in midterm elections. And so it was like, you know, it was a struggle in a lot of ways to get people to understand like this moment, considering we're now in the middle of a Trump administration presidency. We're seeing what's happening, not just at the border, but, you know, in different communities with indigenous folks. Like, we're seeing what's happening with, you know, judges. And, you know, we're like, we need to build a wall of defense, you know, in DC for our people. And when we took up the torch to head to DC to protest and lobby against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, it was not only for that seat, because we knew what a confirmation in that seat would mean and what type of shockwave that was sent across this nation, but it was also a mechanism used to wake people up about the issues that everyday Americans are facing and why it's so important for them to find a lane as quickly as possible and activate their power in it, because we need it to flip the House. We need it to get men and women in there that were from us, that looked like us, that understood, that lived through it, that could speak to our issues, that could write policy and legislation that reflected how we needed to heal, how we needed to grow, how we needed to thrive. And it was from that stage of that occupation of Brett Kavanaugh, from a group that started off with only 30 to 50 people, raising all kinds of hell in DC, getting arrested, filibustering for 18 hours on the Supreme Court steps, sharing our stories, occupying Chuck Grassley's office and Chuck Schumer's office, and, you know, like cornering, you know, Flake in elevators. Like, it was from that work that people started to look around themselves and say, we need to vote in the midterm elections. And what started off as a ground team of 30 to 50 people escalated to 1,500 folks over a month and a half, sharing their stories, lobbying their congressional leaders, their senators, out there marching, protesting, getting arrested, going back home, talking to their families. And through that work, we were able to push people to the polls, and that's how we flipped the House. So although we did not win that nomination, we couldn't, you know, convince elected officials to have some sense and moral dignity for the health of this country. We were able to speak to thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans that didn't normally vote in midterm elections, that couldn't normally formulate a connection on what this meant. And we spoke directly to them and were able to directly activate those people and had wins in the House. And so it was bittersweet. But I learned that there's ripple effects to everything that you do. And we were able to address so many issues through that fight, so many issues that everyday Americans face, whether you're Black, you're white, you're Hispanic, Latinx, indigenous, poor. We were able to speak to a vast, array of folks and like actually shine light on like the validity of everyone's human dignity and that they should be protected at all costs. And so the second part of their question, what do you consider when prioritizing and focusing your efforts? I think it just depends on, hindsight, insight, and foresight. Looking at what has happened in the past and what has moved and what has worked, and then looking at the trajectory of where you want to be in the next 5 to 10 years and strategizing that way. Like, we can't always be in this mode of rapid response. We have to have vision as a people, because the vision was set for us. And again, that's why we're here. The vision was set and it kept escalating and growing and getting more creative. So we have to prioritize our collective vision as people that want a nation to heal. Whether it's a top 3 or top 5 things that we want to move on and strategize in that way and prioritize in that way. And so right now, to be perfectly honest, the strategy and priority right now is saving our democratic process. It's saving our right to be able to dissent, to vote, to have a say in what happens in our everyday lives. So we have to throw everything we have into saving that piece, because if we don't, all of this will become null and void, all of it. And it will start to affect us in the very minute ways in our everyday lives if we do not save and protect this process, and through it protect our human dignity and the rights of everyone. So I'm done with that.
Let me just chime in quickly. I'll do as quickly as I can. I really appreciated that on 2 fronts, and I'll interpret it as I may, and if I misinterpret your intentions, please let me know. But I like how you're putting together 2 seemingly diametrically opposed emotions, visions, virtues. In one sense, you're really calling us to this urgency, and this urgency that's motivated by things like anger, which I'm a big fan of anger. I think the Christian tradition particularly has done a bad job of dealing with anger as a sort of holy virtue that I think it's important. So you push for this urgency, and at the same time you're pushing for this long vision, right? And that's perseverance, that's patience. And those 2 sometimes get seen as you either have to be urgent or you gotta like take your time. But actually they go together. Maybe a week or so ago, I ran into the hall here at CTS. My colleague, Professor Ringer, I kind of miss running into colleagues in the hall. But one of these days we'll get back to something like that. And we were talking about the same process, that sometimes we forget that some fights have taken generations to get to this point. And so we forget the fact that it's both urgency and perseverance, that it's both of these seemingly diametrically opposed kind of moods, that it's both of these together that actually is what long-term and in the immediate begin to kind of form the changes and the flow and the direction that we're pushing for. So I really appreciated that, and I wanted to highlight that piece.
I'm glad that like that resonates, because like as we talk about strategy, like we and even as people start asking questions like, where do I fit in? How do I get to work and all the things? It's like there's so many lanes, and we must understand like a win isn't one person. It isn't a 100-meter dash. It's a relay race. Everybody has a lane, and everybody is a part of a leg. So whether it's press and media, whether it's public pressure with protests, sit-ins, boycotts, whether it's shifting cultural mindset and the language that we use, because that is very important in creating wins, how we talk about things, how we feel about things, whether it's shaping policy, writing legislation, voting folks in that actually doing the work for the good of the people, all of that's the lane. It's all a relay in order for us to cross the finish line of like our collective vision. And so some of it is, some people are part of that first leg. And some people waiting in the middle, like, but you have to be ready for that middle. You got to be ready for that leg. So while you're waiting, do the work that will inform the person that's closest to the finish line. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have to be strategic in that thinking. So yeah, I'm glad you kind of reiterated that. So that's what I hope we get to, that point, just collectively. And it's really all about alignment. You know, in all of our work, our thought processes, our, you know, our healing, our understanding of where we want to go. It's alignment in those things.
We've got about 5 or 6 more minutes of this shared time together. So I want to just take a pause really quick and just open it up for questions that people might be waiting on. There's one